If you travelled a British road in the second half of the 20th century, you shared it with a Bedford. The removal van outside the new house, the ice cream van on a summer street, the green fire engine crewed by soldiers, the 4-ton lorry that carried the army, all of them came from one company. At its peak, the works at Dunstable employed 5,500 people, and by 1978, 3 million Bedfords had been built, nearly half sold overseas. They survived the Depression. They survived the Blitz, when the bombs killed 39 of their own. They survived the post-war slump and decades of industrial turmoil that broke firm after firm around them. It had survived all of it, and none of that is what killed it. Not a war, not a recession, not a rival. It was one decision, made far from this factory floor, at the very hour that should have been its finest. What was it? Chapter 1. The American Check and the County Town. The story of Britain's biggest lorry maker, the company that put the British Army on wheels and kept it there for the better part of a century, begins, oddly enough, with an American check. It was signed in November 1925 for somewhere around $2.5 million, and it bought a struggling car maker in a Bedfordshire town that most of the world had never heard of. The town was Luton. The car maker was Vauxhall Motors, and the buyer was General Motors of Detroit, the largest industrial concern on earth. The man who would make something British out of that American money was called Charles Bartlett. He'd arrived at Vauxhall in 1921 as a bookkeeper, a clerk with a head for figures and very little else to recommend him to history. But Bartlett understood something that the men in Detroit, for all their money, did not. He understood that a British workman would not take pride in building an American truck. He understood that British hauliers, British councils, British farmers, the men who actually signed the checks, wanted to buy British. And so, when GM made him managing director of Vauxhall in 1929, Bartlett set about a quiet act of cultural translation. The capital would be American. The cost control would be American. The engineering nous, and it was considerable, would be American. But everything the customer could see and touch would be, in his words, 100% British. The management, the workforce, the product, all of it. There was a problem, though, and it was a peculiarly British one. Tariffs. Throughout the 1920s, the empire ran a system of preference. Goods made within the empire moved cheaply. Goods made outside it did not. So, before GM ever bought Vauxhall, it had been quietly importing what it called British Chevrolet lorries, assembled in England from parts shipped over from GM's plants in Canada. Canada was in the empire. The tariff dodge worked. By the late 1920s, these machines were being sold under a curious hybrid name, the Chevrolet Bedford, the second word borrowed simply from Bedfordshire, the county in which Luton happened to sit. It was Bartlett's instinct to drop the Chevrolet altogether. And in April 1931, in the depths of the Great Depression, with British industry collapsing all around it, a genuinely British lorry rolled out of Luton wearing only the one name. Bedford. It was a 2-ton machine, plain and honest, and it carried inside it the one piece of American magic Bartlett had been happy to keep, a 6-cylinder overhead valve engine the Americans nicknamed the Stovebolt. It was a wonderful thing, that engine. It gave the Bedford more power than its British rivals, more speed, and better fuel economy than anything Leyland or Carrier could put against it. For a haulier counting pennies in 1931, that last fact wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between staying in business and going under. The market noticed immediately. Within a single year, this brand new name had captured a quarter of all the commercial vehicles built in Britain. A quarter. From a standing start, in the worst economic conditions the country had seen in living memory, production climbed from a little over 11,000 vehicles in 1931 to more than 31,000 by 1937. In 8 years, Bedford went from not existing to dominating. The plain little lorry from Luton had become, in Bartlett's quiet phrase, a dominant force across Britain and the Empire. Nobody could have known it then, but the company that would one day carry the British Army across the deserts of North Africa and the fields of Normandy, the company whose name would be painted on fire engines and removal vans and ice cream vans for 50 years, had just been born in a tariff loophole under an American flag, wearing the name of an English county like a borrowed coat. Chapter 2. The War That Made the Workhorse. In 1935, 4 years before the country was at war, the War Office came quietly to Luton with a request. It wanted a 1,500-weight truck, a light, fast, go-anywhere machine to carry men and equipment. Bedford built it, and in 1939, when the request became an emergency, that truck went to war as the MW. If you want to understand what Bedford meant to Britain, start with a single number. They built nearly 66,000 MWs, 65,995 to be exact, before the war was done. It was the backbone transport of the infantry battalion, the truck that hauled the ammunition and the rations and the men. And it was something else too, something that would tie the Bedford name to a whole generation in a way no advertising ever could. It was the vehicle on which thousands upon thousands of young soldiers learned to drive. A lad who'd never sat behind a wheel in civilian life climbed into a Bedford, ground the gears, stalled it, swore, tried again, and came out the other side a driver. For the rest of their lives, when those men thought of learning to drive, they thought of a Bedford. Then came the bigger machines, the 3,000-weight OX, of which they built more than 24,000, the 3-ton OY, of which they built over 72,000, including the version that hauled the great Queen Mary trailers, the long low transporters that carried damaged aircraft back from the airfields. And in 1941, Bedford built its first four-wheel drive lorry, the QL, which the soldiers christened the Queen Lizzie. They made around 52,000 of those, running off the line at roughly 12,000 a year through the heart of the war. Across the whole conflict, Bedford built well over 250,000 military vehicles. It is no exaggeration to say that no single firm did more to keep the British Army moving. But the war asked more of Luton than lorries. After Dunkirk, with invasion expected within weeks, Vauxhall was handed a job that had nothing to do with anything it had ever made. Design a heavy tank, design it fast, build it. The result was the Churchill, and Bedford's people, who knew lorries and nothing of armour, designed and built the thing from scratch under conditions of near panic. Around 5,500 Churchills came out of Luton and its associated works, along with 2,000 spare engines. The same workforce was also turning out steel helmets by the 100,000 rocket bodies and, in one of the strangest assignments of all, precision components for a young RAF officer named Frank Whittle, who was building something nobody quite believed in yet, a jet engine. The enemy knew exactly what Luton was worth. On the 30th of August 1940, the Luftwaffe came for the works. The bombs fell across the plant in minutes. 39 people were killed, men and women who'd clocked in that morning to build the machines that were keeping the country alive, and who never clocked out. It is one of the quieter facts of the Bedford story, and one of the heaviest. The factory that armed Britain was itself a target, and it paid in blood. It was the war, too, that built the place this story will eventually have to mourn. Luton simply couldn't make everything the country now demanded. The lorries and the tanks and the helmets and the rest, all on one site. So a new factory was thrown up a few miles away. A vast shadow works on a 98-acre site on Bosam Road in Dunstable. It came online in 1942, complete with its own branch railway lines, running goods straight in and finished lorries straight out. It was a child of the emergency, built in haste to win a war. It would outlive the war by half a century, and it would become the beating heart of everything Bedford was about to become. Chapter 3. The Cathedral on Bosam Road. The fighting stopped, but the demand didn't. A broken Britain needed lorries to rebuild itself, to carry the bricks and the coal and the goods that would put the country back on its feet, and Bedford was perfectly placed to supply them. The 500,000th Bedford rolled off the line in 1947. The millionth followed in 1958, and somewhere in those boom years, General Motors made the decision that would define the next 30 years. It would pull all of its truck and bus building out of crowded Luton, leaving the vans there, and concentrate it at Dunstable on the site the war had built. Between 1955 and 1957, they built the cathedral. 2 enormous double-storey factories, 800,000 square feet apiece, covering 46 acres of Bedfordshire. Inside, a single production line ran for a full mile. Imagine standing at one end of it in 1957, a young man on his first morning, looking down a line so long you couldn't see the far end of it for the haze of the place. The moving belt of chassis, the showers of sparks from the welding bays, the unbroken mechanical thunder of a works going flat out. Around 5,500 people worked here. The average wage was about £10 a week. Good, steady money, the kind that bought a house and raised a family and gave a man a reason to stand a little straighter at the bar on a Friday night. The work itself moved in a sequence that the men knew in their bones. The pressed steel arrived and was stamped into shape, the great presses coming down with a concussion you felt in your chest and the soles of your feet. The chassis frames were riveted and bolted and rolled forward. The stovebolt's descendants, those tough six-cylinder engines, were dropped in and married up. The cabs were trimmed, the wiring threaded, the wheels fitted, and at the far end of that mile-long line, a finished lorry coughed into life, was driven off under its own power, and went out through the gates onto Bosam Road and into the working life of the nation. Then the next one, and the next, all day, every day. The smells told you where you were without your eyes. The hot oil and the cutting fluid, the sharp blue tang of welding, the cellulose from the paint shop, thick enough to taste, the frying bacon drifting out of the canteen at the change of shift, and over all of it, the works hooter, not a factory whistle, the men would correct you, a hooter, sounding out across the rooftops of Dunstable to mark the rhythm of the day. Clocking on, dinner, clocking off. You could set your watch by it. Half the town did, because Dunstable had become, in the words of those who lived there, every bit as much a truck town as Leyland was up in Lancashire. The works fed the town, and the town fed the works. New housing estates went up to house the men coming in for the jobs. Shops opened to take their wages. The plant's tall water tower stood over all of it, a landmark you could navigate by, the way other towns navigated by a church spire. Generations followed each other through the gates. A father bringing in his son, a man working the same line his own father had worked, the foreman who'd known you since you were a boy. This wasn't a job you happened to have, it was who you were, and what they built there went everywhere. That's the thing about Bedford that's so easily lost now. This wasn't a specialist mark tucked away in some corner of the market. The Bedford was the ordinary lorry of ordinary British life. It was on every high street and every building site and every farm. When you saw a delivery van pull up outside the shops, when the coal came, when the furniture went into the new house, odds were it was a Bedford that brought it. The works on Bosam Road wasn't making something rare, it was making the moving parts of the country itself. Chapter 4. The name on everything. To grasp how completely Bedford had woven itself into British life, you have to leave the factory floor and go out onto the roads, where the things they built were doing their work, and where very often they were doing far more than just carrying goods. Consider the Green Goddess. In the early 1950s, at the frozen height of the Cold War, the government needed a fleet of fire engines it could hold in reserve against the possibility of nuclear attack. Simple, rugged, mass-produced machines to be crewed by the Auxiliary Fire Service. Bedford built them, over 3,000 of them between 1953 and 1956, painted a deep matte green, based on the big four-wheel-drive military chassis. They were called Green Goddesses, and they became one of those objects that lodge in a nation's collective memory. They sat in home office storage for half a century, kept in reserve, astonishingly, right up until 2004. And on the two occasions when Britain's firefighters went on strike, in 1977 and again in 2002, it was soldiers who climbed aboard those aging green Bedfords and drove out to fight the nation's fires. A Cold War relic, built in Bedfordshire, crewed by the British Army, protecting the public in a labour dispute nobody had foreseen when it was designed. There has never been anything else quite like it. Then there was the TK. Launched in 1960, it was a tilt cab lorry. The cab sat forward, over the engine, and tipped up for access, and it became, quite simply, the quintessential British light truck of the next 20 years. They built more than 500,000 of them. If you are old enough to remember British roads in the 1960s and 1970s, you remember the TK without knowing its name. The brewery dray, the council tipper, the removal lorry, the parcels van. Its military cousin, the MK, which came along in 1970, became the archetypal British Army lorry, over 50,000 of them, the four-tonner that every squaddy of the era knew, that carried the troops and the kit across every training ground and every posting from Germany to the Far East. The civilian TK kept the country's commerce moving. The military MK kept the country's army moving. Same firm, same town, same line, and it didn't stop at lorries. Bedford chassis carried a great swathe of Britain's coaches, the SB, the VM, and the wonderfully strange twin-steer VL, with its two front axles, which earned a small slice of cinema immortality as the coach teetering over the Alpine precipice at the end of the Italian job. There was the CF van from 1969, a fixture outside 1,000,000 homes, the plumber's van, the mobile shop, the ice cream van with its chimes drifting down a summer street, the post office and telephone vans that kept the country connected. Whatever ordinary Britain needed carrying, somewhere there was a Bedford built to carry it. The numbers behind all this were staggering, and they were the kind of numbers that don't get made anymore. By 1978, 3 million Bedfords had been built since that first plain lorry of 1931. 3 million, and here is the figure that ought to be carved somewhere in Dunstable. Of all those millions, very nearly half, 46%, had been sold overseas. Since the end of the war, Bedford had exported more vehicles than any other manufacturer in Britain. Not the most famous British export, not a luxury car for the few. The most exported British vehicle, full stop, was a workaday lorry from a shadow factory in Bedfordshire. Bedfords hauled freight in Africa and Asia and Australia, on roads that were barely roads, in heat and dust and conditions that would have killed a softer machine. The plain honesty Bartlett had built into that first lorry had turned out to travel extraordinarily well. This was the empire then. Not an empire of marble and grandeur, but an empire of usefulness, of a name stamped on the front of the vehicle that brought your coal, fought your fires, carried your army, and flew the British flag on 1,000 foreign roads. For decades it simply was the British lorry. And in a town in Bedfordshire, 5,500 people came to work each morning, believing, with very good reason, that it always would be. Chapter 5. The Summit. Every empire has a single year when it stands at its absolute height, when the view from the top is clearest and the air is thinnest, and for Bedford, that year was 1976. Its share of the British truck market reached its peak. The order books were full. The army was loyal. The export trade was the envy of every rival in the land. The works on Bosam Road thundered away as it had for 20 years, and the men who clocked on each morning under the water tower had no earthly reason to imagine that any of it might end. It looked, from the inside, like permanence itself. A name 3 generations old, a factory built to last, a customer in the Ministry of Defence that had bought Bedford lorries in their tens of thousands since before D-Day and showed no sign of looking elsewhere. When you have been the nation's workhorse for 40 years, it does not occur to you that the nation might one day choose a different horse. But there were shadows on that summit, for anyone who knew where to look. The trouble was that the men who ought to have been looking were 3,000 miles away, in Detroit, and their eyes were on other things entirely. General Motors had a vast empire of its own to run, and within it, Bedford was a small and increasingly distant concern. The money, the real investment money, was flowing into cars, into Vauxhall and into GM's European operations, not into the lorries of Dunstable, and so the core of the Bedford range, the workhorses that earned all that loyalty, were being asked to soldier on year after year on designs that were getting old. The competition, meanwhile, was not standing still. Across the Channel, the great European makers, Volvo, Scania, Mercedes, DAF, were building heavier, more sophisticated lorries, and were beginning, quietly, to take the most profitable end of the market. In 1976, none of this seemed to matter. The market share was at its peak, after all. The empire was intact, and it is the particular cruelty of a summit that you cannot see, from the top of it, that you have already begun the descent. The men on the line that year were building the best lorries in Britain in the company they believed would employ their sons. They could not have known that the decisions which would unmake all of it had, in some quiet sense, already begun to be made. In boardrooms they'd never see, by men who'd never smelled the carbon and the cellulose, or heard the hooter sound across the rooftops of their town. These floors would one day fall silent. The mile-long line would stop. But not yet. In 1976, the Bedford Empire stood at its full height, and the long, slow business of taking it apart was about to begin. Chapter 6. The View from Detroit. The summit held for a few short years. Then the ground began to move, and the men in Dunstable felt the tremors long before anyone in Detroit chose to act on them. The numbers tell it plainly enough. In 1980, Bedford sold 37,000 trucks. By 1984, it sold 14,500. In 4 years, the company's commercial sales had fallen by more than half. Some of that was the times. Britain was deep in recession, and across the whole of Europe, the lorry market was awash with overcapacity. The factories of the continent could build far more trucks than anyone wished to buy, perhaps 40% more, and that surplus drove down prices and drove makers to the wall. But some of it was older and deeper than any recession. It was the slow cost of all those years when the investment had gone elsewhere. Bedford's bread and butter was still the light and medium end of the market, the TK and its successors, fine lorries that had been, at their core, designed back in 1960. When General Motors finally did spend serious money, it spent it on the heavy end, on a big new range called the TM, launched in 1974. The TM was a thoroughly good lorry. The trouble was that it arrived at the party years too late. By the mid-1970s, the European giants, Volvo, Scania, DAF, Mercedes, had already sewn up the lucrative market for heavy tractor units, the big motorway machines that earned the best margins. Bedford pushed the TM into that market and found every good seat already taken. It could not compete with the volume producers on their own ground, and it could no longer count on its old ground staying safe. And then, in 1983, came a decision made entirely in America, by men to whom Bedford was a line on a balance sheet. General Motors detached Bedford from Vauxhall, severed the British company from its own roots in Luton, and folded it into a worldwide truck and bus group run out of Detroit. A planned new van to replace the aging CF, a world van that might have given Bedford a future in the volume market, was quietly scrapped. The message, though nobody in Dunstable was crude enough to say it aloud, was unmistakable. Bedford was no longer a British company that happened to be American-owned. It was an American asset that happened to be in Britain. And American assets that lose money do not stay open forever. So Bedford did the thing that struggling companies do. It leaned on the customer it could rely on. As the commercial market crumbled beneath it, the company turned more and more to the orders that still felt safe. The orders from government, and above all, the orders from the Ministry of Defence. The Army had always bought Bedford. The Army would surely go on buying Bedford. That belief was reasonable. It was rooted in 40 years of loyal service, and it was about to become the most dangerous assumption the company had ever made. Chapter 7. The deal that couldn't be done. By the middle of the 1980s, the bleeding at Bedford had become impossible to ignore and impossible to stop. The figures were laid bare in the House of Commons on the 3rd of July 1986 by David Maddell, the Member of Parliament for the town that depended on the works. General Motors, he told the House, had announced net losses on its British truck operation of £73 million for 1985, up from £62 million the year before and £52 million the year before that. Bedford, he said, was losing something in the region of £1.5 million every single week. Since 1980, the cumulative losses had run past £300 million. No company on earth, however proud its history, could carry a wound like that indefinitely. General Motors knew it, and GM had a plan to stop the bleeding, a plan that nearly worked and whose failure tells you something about the strange place where industry and politics meet. GM proposed to merge its loss-making Bedford truck operation with the truck business of Land Rover Leyland, the troubled state-owned giant. Put the two ailing British truck makers together, the thinking went, rationalise the overlap, and perhaps something viable might survive. It was, on paper, a rescue. But GM wanted something in return. It wanted Land Rover itself, the profitable, world-famous four-wheel drive maker that came bundled with Leyland. And there, the deal ran straight into a wall of national feeling. This was 1986, only months after the Westland affair had torn the government apart over the question of whether a British defence company should fall into foreign hands. The mood in the country, and in Parliament, was raw. The idea of handing Land Rover of all things, with its army contracts and its place in the national imagination, to an American corporation provoked a political revolt. The protest was loud enough, and the timing poisonous enough, that the deal became impossible. So General Motors did what a balance sheet eventually demands. On the 8th of September 1986, it announced that it was withdrawing from the volume truck business in Britain altogether. The rescue had failed, and now came the reckoning. GM set about cutting the Bedford workforce hard, a plan to reduce the 7,200 people across Dunstable and Luton by 1,700 before the year was out. The volume truck rationalisation at Dunstable alone, announced by the plant's chief executive Paul Tosh, accounted for 900 redundancies. 900 families in a truck town told the work was going. The van plant at Luton was hived off into a joint venture with the Japanese maker Isuzu, a new company called AWD Vehicles, which would survive and build vans for years to come. But that was a separate fate, a lifeboat for one part of the operation. The trucks of Dunstable, the heavy heart of the Bedford story, had no such lifeboat. General Motors had decided to leave. The only question now was whether anyone would be mad enough or brave enough to take its place. Chapter 8. The Yorkshireman's Gamble. Someone was. His name was David Brown, and the first thing to say about him, because almost everyone gets it wrong, is that he was not that David Brown. He had nothing to do with the David Brown of the tractors and the Aston Martins. This was a different man entirely, a Yorkshireman, an engineer, and an entrepreneur of real and proven courage. His full name was David John Bowes Brown, and he had made his reputation the hard way. In 1973, he had sold his own house and put up £60,000 of his own money to start a firm building articulated dump trucks, the giant machines that haul earth on construction sites and in quarries. He was good at it. So good that in 1985, he sold the design to Caterpillar, the American earth-moving titan. He won Queen's Awards, 4 of them, over his career. He would later be made a CBE. This was not a chancer or a speculator. This was a man who genuinely knew how to build heavy vehicles and how to build a business around them. In 1987, David Brown looked at the wreck of Bedford's truck operation and saw not a corpse, but an opportunity. He negotiated personally with General Motors and bought the Dunstable plant and the truck business for around £20 million. There was a catch, and it would matter more than anyone realised. General Motors kept the Bedford name. Brown was permitted to use it only on military vehicles. For everything else, he would have to trade under a new name. And so the company became AWD Limited, the letters standing for all-wheel drive, a nod to the four-wheel drive technology that was Brown's particular strength. What he had bought was, in pure engineering terms, magnificent. The assembly hall at Dunstable, modernised in 1979, had a theoretical capacity of 30,000 trucks a year. 30,000. And in 1987, it was building around 5,500. Brown had acquired a factory built for an empire, running at a fraction of its strength. His vision was to fill it again, to revive the old ranges, the TL and the TM and the TK and the export TJ, to re-engine them with good Perkins diesels, to fold in his own all-wheel drive expertise, and to go out and win the world back. For a time, it looked as though he might. AWD employed around 1,200 people. At its height, it claimed a turnover of some £400 million. It won Queen's Awards of its own. The gates were open. The line was moving. A British company, under a British owner, was building British lorries on Bosam Road once more. But the whole edifice rested on a single foundation stone. Brown had inherited not just Bedford's factory and Bedford's designs, but Bedford's deepest assumption, that the British Army would go on buying its trucks from Dunstable, as it had since 1939. The commercial market was brutal and crowded. The export trade was hard-won and uncertain. The one thing that could underwrite the whole gamble, that could keep that vast assembly hall busy enough to survive, was a contract from the Ministry of Defence. And there was one coming, the biggest in a generation. The Army needed to replace its entire fleet of 4-ton lorries, the MK fleet, the descendants of those wartime Bedfords, and whoever won that contract would have years of guaranteed work. David Brown bet everything on winning it. It was a reasonable bet. The Army wanted Bedford. The Army had always wanted Bedford. And reasonable bets, when everything is staked on them, are still bets. Chapter 9. The Contract. In December 1987, 8 prototype lorries from each of the contenders were handed over to the Ministry of Defence for trials. There were 3 contenders. There was AWD, building on the Bedford legacy, offering the lorry the Army had effectively been driving for half a century. There was Volvo's British operation, and there was Leyland, by now in the process of being merged with the Dutch maker DAF into a new company, Leyland-DAF. The trials ran their course, and here the story arrives at the fact that has fueled 40 years of grievance in the town of Dunstable, because by the accounts that have come down to us, the Bedford lorry did not lose those trials. It matched the Leyland. The soldiers who tested it knew it, trusted it, and would have been content to carry on with the mark that had never let them down. The army, by many accounts, expressed a preference to continue the relationship it had relied upon since before D-Day. The army did not get its way. In June 1989, the Ministry of Defence awarded the contract to Leyland. It was worth £155 million for 5,350 vehicles delivered over 5 years. The winning lorry, the Leyland-DAF T244, would begin rolling out to the army in August 1990, and in time it would replace the entire Bedford fleet that had served the country for 2 generations. Why? Why, if the Bedford was as good, and the army content, did Whitehall choose Leyland? The answer that has echoed down the years, the answer believed in Dunstable to this day, is that the decision was political. Leyland-DAF was a fragile new creation, and the government of the day regarded its survival as a national priority. The 4-ton army contract was exactly the kind of guaranteed long-term work that could anchor the new company and give it a fighting chance. To put it plainly, the contract was used to prop up Leyland, and the cost of propping up Leyland was paid by Bedford. Now, it must be said, in fairness and in the spirit of telling the truth, rather than scoring a point, that the full case for the decision has never been laid bare. It is possible the trials showed risks we do not know about, or that the Leyland bid offered value the Bedford bid could not. The political reading rests largely on the testimony of the side that lost, and on the strong contemporary suspicion of an industry that watched it happen. But the suspicion was, and is, widely held, and whatever the true reasoning in those Whitehall offices, the consequence for Dunstable was not in doubt. The one contract on which David Brown had staked the survival of his company, the contract the army itself seemed to want him to have, was gone, awarded to a rival. For reasons the men on Bosam Road would never fully be told. The single bet had been called, and it had lost. Chapter 10. The long way down. The loss of the 4-ton contract did not kill AWD on the spot. That is not how these things happen. It killed it slowly, over the following 3 years. The way a wound you cannot close eventually takes a strong man down. The timing could hardly have been crueler. Just as the great contract slipped away, the entire British truck market collapsed into the recession of 1989 and 1990. Orders dried up across the board. The cheap foreign competition that had been gnawing at Bedford for a decade now bit down hard. The vast assembly hall at Dunstable, built for 30,000 lorries a year, had nothing like enough work to justify its existence. And David Brown, having lost the order that was meant to anchor everything, went looking for something, anything, to fill the gap. He found it, or thought he had, in Libya. There was a large order on the table for civilian lorries, ordinary commercial trucks, not military machines, to be sold to the Libyan market. It was big enough to matter, big enough perhaps to buy the time the company so desperately needed. AWD pinned its hopes on it, and then the world intervened in a way no lorry maker in Bedfordshire could have controlled. In the spring of 1992, in response to Libya's refusal to hand over the men suspected of the Lockerbie bombing, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 748, imposing sanctions including an arms embargo. It was given force in British law by an order in council on the 15th of April 1992. The Libyan order, civilian lorries though they were, was caught in the net. It could not be fulfilled. The lifeline was cut, not by a competitor and not by a Whitehall procurement decision, but by the machinery of international justice, operating 1,000 miles above the heads of the men in Dunstable. With the contract lost, the market collapsed, and now the Libyan order frozen, the cash simply ran out. On the 4th of June 1992, AWD went into receivership. The receivers, Roger Oldfield and Tony Thompson of the accountants KPMG Pete Marwick, walked into the works that the war had built and took control of what was left. They kept it breathing, barely. The great mile-long line, built to turn out a finished lorry every few minutes, was now producing roughly 1 truck a week. 1. The receivers worked hard, to their credit. They chased and secured something like £160 million of new military orders from South America, Asia and Africa, proof that the lorries themselves were still wanted in the world. But proof of demand is not the same as cash in the bank, and the company was past saving as it stood. In the town, the old MP fought to the last. On the 15th of July 1992, in a late-night debate in the Commons, David Medell rose once more to plead for the Dunstable plant, to beg the government to allow the Libyan civilian lorries to be sold to save the works from total collapse. Time, he warned the House, was running out at a terrifying speed. The Trade Minister, Richard Needham, expressed his sympathy, but explained that the decision on whether even to apply for an export licence rested with the company, and no such application was ever made. Medell spoke, too, of the plant's superb industrial relations, of how Dunstable had been spared the bitter strikes that had wrecked so much of British industry in the 1960s and 1970s, how the men and the management here had pulled together. It had been a good place to work, a peaceable place, right to the end. In June and July of 1992, it sold 27 lorries. In the same 2 months a year earlier, it had sold 117. The arithmetic of a death was complete. Chapter 11. The Silence on Bosam Road. In October 1992, the receivers sold what remained of AWD to Marshall of Cambridge, a privately owned maker of special-purpose vehicles. The price was never disclosed, but it was reported to be a fraction of the £20 million David Brown had paid General Motors just 5 years before. A works that had once employed 5,500 people changed hands for small change. Of the roughly 850 workers left at AWD, most were made redundant. Of the 150 still at Dunstable, only about half were offered jobs at Cambridge, 40 miles away, in another county, building under another company's roof. Marshall took the licence to use the Bedford name on export vehicles and built the old TL and TJ lorries in small numbers for a few more years. The very last of them, an order of 100 TJs bound for Kenya, were built in 1998. And with that, after 67 years, the building of Bedford lorries came to an end. The works themselves did not last much longer. The receivers began pulling down the oldest buildings in 1993. A Sainsbury's supermarket rose on part of the ground, and around it the usual retinue of a modern retail park, a McDonald's, a Quick Fit, the showrooms and the sheds. For a while, the two great factories of the 1950s, the ones with the mile-long line, were rented out as distribution space. For a time, IKEA stored its flat-packed furniture in the halls where the Churchill tank's descendants had once been born. Then, in 2005, those last great buildings came down too, and the water tower with them, the landmark that had stood over Dunstable for half a century, that men had navigated home by, gone in an afternoon of dust. Modern distribution units stand on the site now. The damage rippled outward, as it always does. The component suppliers who had clustered around the works for decades found their great customers simply gone, and many followed it into oblivion. The lorries themselves proved more durable than the company that made them. The British Army's old Bedford MK fleet, the 4-tonners the company had built and then lost the contract to replace, soldiered on far beyond the death of their maker. They were not finally retired until 2014, replaced at last by German MAN trucks. There is a bitter symmetry in that. The Army kept faith with the Bedford for 22 years after Bedford itself was gone, and when it finally let go, it turned not to a British maker. There were precious few left, but to Germany. The Green Goddesses were sold off from 2004, many of them going to fire brigades in Africa, still pumping water under a foreign sun. And out in Pakistan and Nigeria and a dozen other hard countries, Bedford TJs are working still, hauling their loads on roads that would shake a modern lorry to pieces, decades after the gates on Bosam Road closed for the last time. There is one final, quiet closing of a door. The Luton plant, the original home where Bartlett built that first Bedford in 1931, where the Churchill tanks were made and the bombs fell in 1940, kept building vehicles long after Dunstable fell. It went on as a van factory, under one owner and then another, for decades more. And then, in March 2025, it too closed its doors, ending vehicle production in Luton after 120 years. The town where it all began builds nothing on wheels anymore. Chapter 12. What the Hooter Knew. Stand on Bosam Road today, and there is nothing to tell you what was here. A supermarket car park, the low sheds of a distribution estate, the ordinary, useful, forgettable furniture of a modern English roadside. No water tower, No mile-long line. No hooter sounding across the rooftops to tell the town it was time to come home. The thing about a silence in a place built for noise is that it doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, in the wrong shape, where the thunder used to be. It is worth being clear about what was lost here, and what wasn't. This was not the story of a bad company brought down by its own foolishness. Bedford built superb lorries. Its workers were skilled, and its industrial relations were the envy of the trade. The army wanted its trucks to the very end. This was a company that survived the Depression, that armed Britain through its darkest war and was bombed for its trouble, that exported more vehicles than any other British maker, that put a name on 3 million lorries and sent them out to every corner of the earth. It survived everything the 20th century could throw at a manufacturer. Everything except a chain of decisions, no single one of them obviously fatal, that together took it apart. An American parent that came to see it as a line on a distant balance sheet and starved it of the investment that might have kept it competitive. A merger that might have saved it, killed by politics in the rawest of political seasons. An owner of real courage who took it on and staked its survival on a single great contract. A government that gave that contract to a rival, for reasons it never fully explained, while the army that would use the lorries seemed to want it the other way. A recession, and at the very last, an order frozen by sanctions aimed at something 1,000 miles away. No villains, no single catastrophe, just a long sequence of reasonable-seeming decisions, each one moving the work a little further from the town that knew how to do it, until there was no work, and no town that did it, and no one left to sound the hooter. The men who built those lorries are old now, or gone. But ask any of them, and they'll tell you the same thing. They'll tell you the Bedford was a good lorry. They'll tell you Dunstable was a good place to work. And they'll tell you with the particular quiet certainty of men who were there that the army never wanted to give it up, that the trucks they built carried the British soldier safely for 50 years and went on carrying him for 22 years more after the gates had closed. That is the thing about a workhorse. It doesn't ask for monuments. It just does the work faithfully for as long as it's allowed to. And then one day it's gone, and only the people who depended on it ever really notice the silence where it used to be.